Hi, and welcome to our webcast, Exchange 2016, your top 10 questions answered. I'm your host, Paul Robichaux. I'm the CTO of eNow Software, which, as some of you may know, makes monitoring and reporting software for Office 365 plus Microsoft's on-prem workloads. And I've been a Microsoft Exchange MVP since 2002. Today I'm going to be talking about Exchange 2016. You may remember that a few months ago, msexchange.org sponsored a webcast that I did with fellow MVP Justin Harris from Binary Tree. We talked about what's new in Exchange 2016. We got a ton of really good questions, and so I decided it would be a good idea to do a follow-up where we took the top 10 questions. I got some input from Justin on these and went through them to help people understand what they were getting, what they weren't getting, what was happening around Exchange 2016. So I want to jump right in to talking about those questions and their answers. The first very common question that I get is, what's different about the product? Normally in the past, when Microsoft has released a new version of Exchange, we've all been conditioned to expect a lot of big changes. And frankly, this time the changes we've gotten have been smaller. There are only two server roles now. There's the combined mailbox and CAS role, and there's the edge server role, the edge transport server role, which nobody uses. So as a practical matter, for your Exchange 2016 implementation, you can assume that there really is one role. That's combined mailbox and CAS. It also does it also does what the hub transport role used to do in older versions. So that simplifies your deployment somewhat. Failovers are faster, up to a third faster, which is significant when you consider how short the failover times in Exchange 2013 could be. We can create DAGs that don't have an IP address any longer. Microsoft calls them anonymous DAGs, which means that because you don't have to have a cluster network object explicitly assigned, it's easier to manage DAGs, easier to maintain them, because there's no longer a requirement for you to implement anything on the network side. MAPI over HTTP is used by default. There's a new version of the Exchange ActiveSync protocol that relatively few devices are able to take advantage of, but I expect that's going to change. Search is much better. There's more integration with Office 365. And so far, everything I've described, you can look at and say, well, okay, great. But what am I going to tell my end users? How am I going to convince an end user that this is an upgrade that benefits them in some way? So I would say the big enchiladas here from an end user standpoint are, number one, support for modern attachments. This is a feature that allows you to take an attachment and automatically upload it to OneDrive or OneDrive for Business and send the recipient a stub object that points to that attachment. I love this because I hate when people send me documents for review or editing as email attachments. I would much rather get a link to a OneDrive for Business or OneDrive or SharePoint repository so that I'm not spending my email system's time and bandwidth shuttling giant attachments around just so I can make a one-line change and then ship it back in email. In-place hold for public folders is a big deal if you depend on the hold functionality in Exchange to be able to retain records, and a greatly improved OA experience. In fact, it's really interesting. I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later, but if you look at what Microsoft has done with cloud-first features that have gone into Exchange Online and have been backported to Exchange On-prem, you can make an argument that some of the features that we're now getting in Exchange On-prem are starting with Outlook.com. For example, the ability to use the @ sign with someone's name to create a mention like you would on Twitter or in Facebook. That started with Outlook.com. It got ported to Exchange Online and is being released in the first release wave of clients for Outlook for the Mac, Outlook Mobile, and Outlook for Windows. So not only are we getting features that trickle down to on-prem from Exchange Online, some of those features are not starting in Exchange Online. They're starting in Outlook.com, which is Microsoft is in the process, by the way, of moving to run completely on the Exchange Online infrastructure. So question number 2, why should I upgrade? So in days of old, by which I mean, say, Exchange 2003, Exchange 2007, Microsoft sort of had this expectation that everybody would want to upgrade because with every release of the product, they were releasing such major improvements. If you think back to the time of Exchange 2000, look at the gap between 2000 and 2003, or 2003 and 2007, or 2007 to 2010. We got significant improvements in each one of those. We got PowerShell in Exchange 2007. We got DAGs in Exchange 2010. We got unified messaging in Exchange 2007. Exchange 2013 was much more a refinement in a lot of ways of what we had in Exchange 2010. It made some major architectural changes and added some very nice features like transport redundancy, but it also architecturally was similar in many ways to 2010, to the point where if you understood 2010, you had a pretty good leg up on understanding the architecture and behavior of 2013. So one question I frequently get from people is, okay, I have an Exchange infrastructure and it works fine right now. I am happy with what it does from a functionality standpoint. It's on hardware that's already paid for. It's mature. It's robust. Why would I want to upgrade? Well, in the past, Microsoft's answer was always, number one, we'll give you great new functionality that will make your life better. And number two, we will save you money by increasing scale and increasing your ability to consolidate. So what are the answers to the question of why you might want to consider upgrading to Exchange 2016? Well, the first one that comes to my mind is supportability. I work for a software vendor. So I have customers that are using Exchange 2007, Exchange 2010, Exchange 2013, Exchange 2016, Exchange Online. I probably have some customers who are still on Exchange 2003, but because we don't support that version anymore, I don't officially know that. Same thing is true with Microsoft. They've already announced that the end of life for Exchange 2007 will be April 2017. So the writing is on the wall if you have Exchange 2007. Even if you don't, let's say that you have Exchange 2010, the end of life for Exchange 2010 is going to be in 2020, probably. Or let me rephrase that. It shouldn't be any sooner than 2020 based on Microsoft's existing support policies. So what that might lead you to think is, okay, you know what? I have at least another three and a half years before I have to worry about that. But the fact of the matter is that upgrades never happen in a vacuum. They always take time. They take planning. And so it's not like you can wait until a month before end of life and just sort of screech into an upgrade with your tires smoking. You need to plan it far enough in advance to be able to execute it without a lot of emergency flapping, as I would call it. So supportability would be the first thing I would be looking at. Is the version of Exchange that you're currently on going to be supportable during the time frame that you need it to be? Number two is functionality. Is there functionality that your business would benefit from having that you would get if you moved from whatever version of Exchange you're on now to Exchange 2016? Now, this is a tricky question because if you were to talk to somebody with a blue Microsoft badge on their belt, they'd be able to make a pretty compelling argument that the most functionality you can get will come from upgrading to Office 365 and Exchange Online. I'll talk more about why that is in a few minutes, but it's true. On the other hand, you have to counterbalance the shiny new functionality you get from the fact that if you move to the cloud, you're giving up some visibility and control over your on-premises environment that perhaps you want to have. Now, the next reason, and these are not in any particular order, by the way, the next reason is scalability and consolidation. I mentioned this before. Microsoft has done a really good job, version over version of Exchange, of squeezing more horsepower out of the same hardware. So if you think back, for example, to the I/O performance improvements between Exchange 2007 and Exchange 2010, in some cases they could be 70% or more. So if you imagine a scenario that would take 100 IOPS to satisfy before, now maybe we could satisfy it in 30 IOPS or 35 IOPS. That meant you didn't need as many spindles. Well, you can draw a straight line between Microsoft making these scalability and performance improvements and the situation we have now where people are increasingly choosing to deploy Exchange on top of direct attached JBODs, right? You don't need a SAN to give you huge performance if you have very efficient disk I/O, which Exchange does. You don't need a SAN to give you super high degrees of data redundancy and replication if you're using an application that already has native data protection capabilities, as Exchange does. So Microsoft's argument is still that however many servers you have running an older version of Exchange, you can get by with a smaller number of less expensive servers and less expensive storage if you move to 2016. And that can be a very compelling case for larger organizations. Security. Okay, now here's the thing. Microsoft went through a reset back in about 2000 with the Trustworthy Computing Initiative. They dramatically changed the way that they approach product development and product implementation. It cost them a lot of money. They took a lot of arrows in the back from the trade press and from their users and from the Linux community and pretty much everybody. Microsoft was a target because of trustworthy computing. But in retrospect, that was absolutely the right decision to make. So I'm very comfortable telling people, yes, you can run Exchange 2010, you can run Exchange 2013, you can run Exchange 2007, and still have reasonable confidence in its security. The difference is that if you look at 2007, for example, or 2010 for that matter, if you have a 2010 environment that's published by something like TMG, well, maybe you shouldn't. The security landscape has changed. The scope and breadth and type of threats that we face when putting internet-connected systems out into the world has changed quite a bit. So it's not so much that Exchange itself is not able to keep up, because if you think about it, you can isolate an Exchange environment pretty well by only allowing SMTP traffic to it and only allowing HTTPS traffic to it. So the relative degree of risk there is pretty low. But the fact of the matter is that the closer you get to modern Exchange, the more functionality you get. For example, in Exchange 2016, you can use BitLocker. It's fully supported to encrypt all of your data at rest. That's a huge advantage because it means that somebody who could physically attack you and steal a server ends up with a disk that they can't read, with EDB files on it that they can't decrypt because the entire volume is protected with BitLocker. That's a significant advantage. It's not something to give away lightly. Finally, we have life extension. So when I was at Dell, I worked with a customer, and this was in 2014. I worked with a customer that was just then upgrading their Exchange infrastructure, and they were deploying Exchange 2010. I thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. Because if you think about what deploying Exchange 2016 right now would give you, it's going to give you guaranteed support from Microsoft until at least 2026. Okay, think about what that means. I guess actually, let me back up a step. I guess technically that's not true. It'd be 2025. But if you think about having another, 9 years of product support, that's pretty significant. That gives you a lot of options in terms of what you do with your messaging environment over the next 9 years. And that's not to say that you have to do it right now. Maybe you want to wait until next year sometime, maybe even the year after. Nobody knows, exactly what the optimal time for doing those kinds of things will be, because it's going to depend on your organization, how big your organization is, what its needs are, what you think about moving to the cloud, and so on. But the fact of the matter is that moving from whatever you have now to Exchange 2016 is going to buy you until that 2025 end of life date to have a supported, robust messaging environment. How do I upgrade? Well, thank heavens, this question has been answered once and for all. Like many of you, I suffered through years of doing in-place upgrades of Exchange and in-place upgrades of Windows. Microsoft has really nailed down the use case for in-place Windows upgrades pretty well, to the point where with Windows 10, you can routinely do in-place upgrades of insider builds, and to the extent you have problems, they're not going to be problems with doing the upgrade. They're problems with, the software that you get installed. But I never liked doing that with applications like Exchange. There were just too many complicated pieces, and I especially didn't like the idea of having to go through a database page by page or block by block and try to convert it to a different logical and physical format. So Microsoft doesn't do that anymore. The only supported way to upgrade is for you to install some Exchange 2016 servers and move mailboxes to them. Now, there are a lot of pros and cons about different approaches that you might take to do that. I have seen customers who said, well, we want to start completely from scratch. So they set up a greenfield Active Directory forest. They set up a greenfield Exchange 2016 organization and migrated their entire organization into that. By far, it's more common to see people that already have 2010 or 2013 install 2016 and start moving mailboxes to it. Now, because Microsoft folks are smart, They anticipated that's probably what people would do, and they provided full support for doing that. So you can have 2013 DAGs and 2016 DAGs in the same organization. You cannot have a 2013 server in a 2016 DAG or vice versa, but that's not actually a huge deal. One very interesting thing, if you remember at MEC or uh, Ignite, seeing Ross Smith's presentation about the preferred architecture for Exchange, one of the key points he made was that 2013 had a number of architectural changes that were made to allow it to do both up version and down version proxy. See, if you had Exchange 2010 when you installed it, a 2010 server could accept, or sorry, a 2010 CAS or server could accept a connection and send it to an Exchange 2010 or Exchange 2007 server, depending on where the target mailbox was. And there was logic in that server version that enabled it to say, okay, this version is going to 2010, so I'm going to, or sorry, this target mailbox is on 2010, I'm going to do one thing. This other target mailbox is on 2007, so I'm going to do something different. When 2013, that logic was expanded so that not only can 2013 proxy traffic down to older versions, it also is smart enough to say, oh, wait a minute, this traffic is going to or asking for data from a mailbox that's on a newer version of Exchange. So I'm going to proxy it upward to that target server. So 2016 is the same way. 2016 can proxy both up and down. The advantage to doing that is that with older versions of Exchange, you always had to install the new version and send all of your traffic to it. All your SMTP traffic, all your CAS traffic, traffic, all had to go to the new version, because if you sent it to the old version would not know how to route traffic to a mailbox that had been installed on one of the new servers. We don't have that restriction anymore. This is huge because this gives you a great deal of flexibility in how you construct namespaces, how you do load balancing, where you put certificates, because the simplest solution is that you just start installing 2016 servers in your organization, assemble them into a DAG, and move mailboxes to them. Leave all your client traffic flowing through 2013, and once you've moved all the mailboxes, then cut client traffic over. That's an entirely valid approach. That's much simpler to implement than the way we used to have to do it. However, if you have 2007 or 2010, then what you're going to have to do is install 2016 first and send your traffic to it. So this is a common question. People will say, well, I have Exchange version blah with service pack blah and rollup blah. Can I upgrade? So my professional answer is go to Microsoft's site. They will give you a complete matrix of which versions are supported to do upgrades. But in general, yes, you can upgrade from Exchange 2007, and you better hurry. People seem to like having Exchange 2013 servers in place so that they can do a two-hop migration. And when I say they like it, what I mean by that is that it's easier to do. There are better migration tools, better visibility and control over what actually happens. That's a huge improvement over doing it directly from 2007. But if your budget or schedule or level of organizational maturity doesn't allow that, then it's a nice to have. It's not mandatory. Exchange 2010, yep. Make sure you're on the latest service pack and rollup. Exchange 2013, yep. Same deal. Do you have to make any changes to your Active Directory? Now, this is a really tricky question. The reason I say that is that people often make the assumption that the version of Active Directory and the version of Windows they use have to be the same. And the fact of the matter is they don't. Okay. Windows Server 2016 Active Directory, whatever Microsoft ends up calling it when they finally release the public version, and I guess they've already released it to manufacturing, but you can't actually deploy it yet. It has nothing in it that Exchange 2016 requires, and in fact, I don't even think it has anything in it that Exchange 2016 can actually use for anything. Now, that's not to say that AD 2016, let's just call it that. AD 2016 has a ton of nifty stuff in it. For example, if you look at what Microsoft used to call Microsoft Passport and now calls Windows Hello for Work, man, the ability to use that to replace smart cards and replace a physical PKI, to use biometrics like fingerprints or iris prints or facial recognition throughout your organization, tremendously powerful. Has nothing to do with Exchange, right? So the AD changes that Microsoft has put into Server 2016 AD are orthogonal to what we use Exchange for. Now, Microsoft is going to support running Exchange 2016 on Windows 2016. But really, the people for whom that's relevant are people, probably some of you on this webcast, who haven't deployed Exchange 2016 yet. If you already have, you would already have deployed it on 2012 R2, which is totally fine. As you add Exchange servers in the future, maybe you would deploy them on Server 2016, maybe not. That's going to be an organizational consideration that's dictated by what your hardware vendors support, what your Microsoft license agreements allow you to do, and so on. But there's no requirement that you use Windows Server 2016 for anything, anywhere having to do with Exchange 2016. Do I still need the preferred architecture? Well, first, let me weed out all the smart alecks in the audience who say, I never needed the preferred architecture. You have to understand, Microsoft designed and released the preferred architecture as a preferred architecture. Now, it sounds like a tautology, so I'll explain. They never said that the PA was mandatory. What they said is, this is the way we recommend you do it to eliminate as much complexity as possible, because complexity is the enemy of stability. If you talk to the big studs at Microsoft Consulting Service, somebody like Boris Lukvitsky or Robert Gillies, they will tell you, for hundreds of dollars an hour, they will tell you that the more complicated your Exchange environment is and the more moving parts you have in it, the harder it is to maintain and manage, the more likely that it will break, and the more likely that when it breaks, it will be a big pain to get it fixed. The preferred architecture simplifies things as much as possible. There's a quote I love by a guy I love, a man named Ed Heinemann, who was one of the foremost aircraft designers of the post-World War II period in the United States. He had a plaque on his desk that said, "Simplicate and add lightness." So if you think about adding lightness, it sounds kind of funny, but when you think about it, what he really meant was make things as simple as you can, even though it may be more work up front to make something that is simple and light. If you do it that way, it will pay off many times over in the lifetime of the thing that you're designing. So the preferred architecture is designed to make your life better by, for example, using JBOD wherever possible. That means you save money on not having to buy SANs in the first place. You reduce complexity by not having any of the infrastructure or care and feeding that comes along with SANs. No firmware updates, no HBAs, no maintenance contracts, none of that, because it's simpler. You can certainly make an argument that if I sit down with a customer and that customer is able to cherry pick details of their environment, that they could make an argument why they should be using SANs. Hey, Paul, we just spent $3 million on an Exchange SAN, and or on a SAN that we have to use with Exchange in addition to its other workloads. And if we don't use it, everyone's going to get fired. Okay, great. I accept that argument. We have a SAN, and we've been using it for Exchange, and I can't afford to move away from it for operational or political reasons. Okay, I understand that. From a technical standpoint, though, there are very few compelling reasons to stay on SAN, and the PA recognizes that. So if you look at the Exchange 2016 PA, which again is on TechNet on the Exchange team blog in more detail than I have time to go into here, you'll see that although there are some differences between the 2013 and 2016 PAs, same basic approach. Use a building block. So design a DAG that is an appropriate size and then have more than one of those as necessary to support scale in your environment. Microsoft for a while has been recommending consolidating roles on servers. Well, now they enforce that, so that's nice. We don't have to worry about that. Use JBOD. Simplify your namespace design. Simplify your certificate planning. In other words, do what Microsoft has done in Office 365 by trying to come up with the simplest design with the fewest moving parts and fewest things that can break, and then stamping out multiple copies of that design in your environment if you need it to scale up. Now, one thing that I want to point out, um, Justin and I mentioned this in our preceding webcast, but it's worth repeating. If you look at the underlying product architecture for Exchange 2016, and you look at how I/O works, you look at how DAGs work, most of those fundamental behaviors are not changed. So you'll still use the Exchange Storage Calculator, although it has been updated to reflect some specifics of 2016. It's largely unchanged. You'll still use the Exchange 2013 stress and performance tools to validate your I/O loads on your storage design, whether that's with JBOD or with SAN. The one change I want to point out is that we have this Office Online Server thing. I don't really can't really think of a better term for it than that you'll need for some types of modern attachment handling, and you have to decide if that functionality is something that you want. If so, where are you going to locate the OOS role? How are you going to configure it and maintain it? Are you licensed for it? Because some licenses, some license agreements or license editions of Exchange provide support for it while others don't, and so on. Overall, though, the more closely you stick to the preferred architecture, the happier your Exchange deployment experience is likely to be. What's the killer feature? Man, I've been asked this practically every time anybody has talked to me about Exchange 2016. I would love to be able to come back and say, wow, you know what? The best thing about Exchange 2016 is that it feeds you ice cream whenever you want it, or it looks like a Corvette and it sounds like a P-51. But the truth of the matter is that Microsoft doesn't have a single feature that they can point at that makes a really compelling case for why you would upgrade. It's a little sad in some ways because we've all gotten accustomed to having these giant improvements year over year or version over version in Exchange. So what we've got in 2016 is a collection of smaller improvements. Maybe none of them are awesome. So instead of losing, 20 pounds, maybe I've only lost 5 pounds. Or instead of, pick your metaphor for improvement. But the way I like to think of it is it's 2013 better. So it's got faster failovers in 2013. It's more I/O efficient than 2013. It's more scalable than 2013. Then there's some intangibles that I think are important, but nobody's going to upgrade to be able to take advantage of them. So what I mean is when I say, hey, you know what, there's more commonality with the code in the service. Well, nobody's going to deploy Exchange 2016 because I tell them, yeah, it's the same code that's running in Office 365, right? That's what I mean by not compelling. Number one, it's a hell of an engineering achievement that Microsoft has accomplished. Number two, it means that because Microsoft is having you run the same code on-prem that they run in the service, by the time it gets to you, it has been thoroughly proven in that very large scale, very high demand environment, which is great, right? The idea behind that is that when you get code, it's going to have thoroughly been tested and validated in a way that we never had in older versions of Exchange. So that's nice. But if you think about how often you actually upgrade Exchange in the first place, you may look at that and say, well, that's not really compelling enough to get me to spend the money to do the upgrade. Where I think the attention for a killer feature should go is to say, okay, the killer feature here is the improvements that I get compared to 2007 or compared to 2010. If you're already on Exchange 2013, then I would completely understand if you heard this slide and walked away from this webcast and said, well, yeah, I don't really see any reason to move to 2016. Honestly, Microsoft is seeing that too, right? If you look at adoption data for 2016, the people who are eager to adopt it are the ones on 2007 and 2010. People that have 2013 look at it and say, I'm okay. I'll stick with what I have. And if anything, maybe I'll move to Office 365 and get on the service. So let's talk about the service for a second. Microsoft has taken a lot of heat, deservedly, for telling people that there are certain features that they're going to deploy cloud first, and there are other features that they're going to deploy that will be cloud only. Now, you can have great arguments with the feature owners of these features at Microsoft about why and whether this makes sense and so on. But the fact of the matter is, it is what it is. There are some features that are never going to be rolled out on-prem. There are others that maybe will make it on-prem and maybe won't, and then there's some that on-prem will get, but some, with some lag or with some time passing before the product feature makes it from the service to your server. So if you deploy Exchange 2016, there are some Exchange Online features that 2016 doesn't have and probably isn't going to. So Office 365 Groups is a big one. Tony Redmond has spent a lot of time talking about the collaboration technologies that underlie groups. And from an engineering standpoint, again, it's a great accomplishment. Microsoft has done a really good job of taking some individual features they already had throughout the service and snapping them together in a way that really makes for a smooth, useful collaboration experience for people. But you can only do that in Office 365. Clutter, although that's being replaced with Focused Inbox, which also is not available on-prem. Delve Analytics, integration with Planner. There are a bunch, my current favorite right now, I would say, is probably the Find Time add-in from Microsoft Garage. If you haven't used it, you can go to findtime.microsoft.com and download this add-in. What it does, it's an add-in that goes into Outlook, and when you want to schedule a meeting with somebody, it lets you send a poll to the recipient. So you pick some times from your calendar. It looks at your calendar and does free busy analysis for all the recipients to try to show you quickly what times are going to work for the majority of people. And then you can send out a poll. So every recipient can say, all right, Paul sent me 4 potential time slots for a meeting. I like this one. Everybody does that. And once everybody agrees, if everybody agrees on one time, the meeting goes onto your calendar and a meeting invite is sent out. If not everybody agrees, then you as the meeting owner get to look at the poll results and say, well, okay, Paul can make it at this time, and Jay can make it at this time, and Dana can make it at this time. And here are the people who are most important to have in the meeting. So I'm going to juggle things around to make sure I accommodate their requirements. Super useful tool, and a great example of the kind of continuing value that Microsoft is shoveling into Office 365 every week. Basically, I mean, week after week, we keep getting new goodies. And most of those new goodies are not coming on-prem. Okay, it's sad, but it's also true. Microsoft is big and they can do anything, but they can't do everything. And one of the things they're deliberately choosing not to do is to roll all this advanced functionality back into the on-prem version of the product. Now, the good news is that over time, we will probably see some of these things change as Microsoft either learns more or adapts their technologies. Great example. Tony Redmond wrote a long article about this a couple of weeks ago, talking about the change in Exchange Online that enables it to act as a cache for the Outlook mobile app. So Microsoft had to do this because they wanted to get the Outlook backend off of Amazon Web Services. But as a side effect of doing that, now they're going to be able to fully support using the Outlook mobile app against on-prem mailboxes by using Exchange Online. I don't remember what they're officially called, but I call them invisible mailboxes as a caching mechanism. Great example of Microsoft figuring out what kind of Legos they had in their toy box and using them to make something cool that they didn't originally plan to do. So it's certainly possible that we will see some of these other service-only features come back to on-prem someday. But Microsoft is, as always, very tight-lipped about what they might do and when they might do it. Here's the big question, right? People ask this all the time. And they ask it about SharePoint. They ask it about Exchange. Interestingly, they don't seem to be asking it as much about Skype. I'm not sure why that is. It'd be a fascinating debate to have over a beer at Ignite. For those of you who are going, please feel free to come find me at the eNow booth and let's talk about it. But I included this picture because in some ways the reply is hazy. Microsoft has not made any announcements one way or another about what they think the future of on-prem Exchange is. On one hand, you can read between the lines if you look at where they are investing their money and where they think their customer growth is coming from. On the other hand, Microsoft is run by some extremely smart people who are very good at math. And what the math tells me is that there's a very large number of installed Microsoft Exchange mailboxes on premises running at customers who want nothing to do with the cloud. Right off the top of my head, I could name 3 or 4 customers that between them have probably 2 million mailboxes. And when I say customers, I mean customers of mine at eNow who are not in the cloud, don't want to go to the cloud, won't go to the cloud unless Microsoft absolutely forces them to. And there are many others like them. So I think as long as Microsoft can continue making money from on-prem solutions, they're going to continue making money from on-prem solutions. When they get to a point where they say, okay, you know what, the installed base is not sufficient to support continuing to invest in on-prem software, then they may make a different decision. But at least for right now, I think the odds are very good that we're going to continue to see additional on-premises versions of Exchange. Now, here's the interesting thing. Those versions may take a different form than what we're used to see. Just because Microsoft continues to ship on-premises Exchange does not mean we're going to continue to see Exchange 2016 followed by Exchange 2018 followed by Exchange 2021. What they could certainly do instead is say, we're going to move to a perpetual model, sort of like they have with Windows 10. Right? The idea behind Windows 10 is that Microsoft will release updates and Windows 10 will stay Windows 10 for a pretty long time. And I think if it were up to them, if it were up to the Windows team, they might move to a model where it was just called Windows. You already see a blurring of the distinctions between Windows 10 on the desktop, Windows 10 on mobile, Windows 10 on Xbox One, and Windows 10 on other devices. And that's intentional. Microsoft is smearing those boundaries together because with a common code base and the ability to write UWP applications, it really doesn't matter to the application vendors, and it doesn't matter to Microsoft what device you happen to be running Windows on. It's still Windows everywhere. So I can see Microsoft saying, all right, we're going to continue to ship updates to Exchange, but we're just going to call it Exchange Server. It's not going to be called Exchange Server 2019. It'll just be Exchange Server, and we'll do updates every quarter or every 6 months or on whatever schedule they think makes sense. So it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves. I feel like sometimes I should write these predictions down and bury them in my backyard, dig them up in 5 years and see how I did. So the last question is one that I get all the time, not necessarily in the context of Exchange 2016, but just in general. When people say, one of the things that scares me about the cloud is that I don't know what's happening. I don't have a good way to monitor what's going on in my cloud environment. And oftentimes when I talk to them, it turns out they don't really have a good understanding of what's going on in their on-premises environment either, because they don't have monitoring or they don't have alerting. They don't have reporting. There's missing stuff that means that they can't see everything they need to see about their environment. So if you assume from the start that email is critical, then my argument would be that monitoring it is critical too. Being able to see the health of your servers, being able to get reports on how resources are being consumed and which disks have a lot of space and which ones don't. Are backups being done? Has managed availability been performing any shenanigans in the background that you might like to know about? Are all the endpoints that clients attempt to connect to from outside your main campus, are those all reachable? And so on. Well, the short answer is I happen to work for a company that makes some mighty fine solutions for answering exactly those kinds of questions to give you complete visibility into everything that's happening in your on-premises environment, whether that environment is Exchange 2007 all the way up through 2016, Skype, SharePoint, Active Directory. We monitor and manage Office 365, DirSync, ADFS. Basically, if it's a Microsoft server product, we have the ability to help you see exactly what it's doing and then get actionable insights about how it's performing and what you need to do to keep it up and going. So that ends the commercial. If you'd like to know more, you're welcome to drop me a line or just go by our website at enowsoftware.com. Thank you very much for coming by. I'm going to take some questions in chat now, and the moderators will be releasing information about how to get a recording of the presentation so that you can watch it again and again, as I know nobody will want to do that, but you might want to watch it once more. Anyway, thanks again for attending.